GameDev is about trial and error, kinda like a Soulsborne game. You fail a ton, learn from your failures, and then use the knowledge to inch closer to succeeding. That's why I decided that I'm gonna make a video where I go through my abandoned projects from my most recent to my oldest, so we can see what I did right and also what I did wrong to help you avoid the same mistakes I made. The idea for this project came about when I was watching the first Saw movie with some friends. It specifically popped up at this scene. As you could probably guess, the idea was having the player's light source be a camera flash. Originally this was planned to be a short, linear horror game meant to be completed in around 15 minutes, but it didn't get developed further than the character controller and the opening area. The main reasons for the project's failure were the lack of planning, and the fact that the main gimmick of the game ended up feeling really annoying to use. I would show more footage, but there isn't anything more to see about this one, so let's just move on. This is the first of many gem games that are going to appear in this video. The theme for the gem was shopping, and it had to include cards, so I came up with the brilliant idea to make a shopping roguelike. One of the parts I actually really ended up liking about this one was the character controller. It handles kinda like an arcade racer, and it can interact with the physics-based products in a realistic way. Since it was meant to be a roguelike, the map was procedurally generated. The way the map is generated is heavily inspired by what Spelunky does. First, I split the map into 15 by 15 rooms, then I select one of the many room templates to populate it with. Then, once I'm done generating the map, I get all the shelves and randomly spawn products on them that the player can put in their cart. Probably saw some red guys running around in the previous clips. They were planned to be the enemies, but I only had a very placeholder version of them implemented. The original idea was them being shoppers who went crazy and are just blindly running around the place without caring for anyone around them. Their AI is basically just a racist that checks if anything is in front of them, and if there is, they just rotate a random amount between 20 and 40 degrees, which can result in some pretty silly behavior sometimes. This was about when I realized that my idea is way too big to be finished before the gem ends, so I ended up dropping out. This is yet another game that was made for a gem. This time around it was made for the incremental gem, which had micro as its theme. My idea was having the player terraform a small planet from an icy red rock to a lush paradise by placing machines that change parts of the planet. The base idea was kinda stolen from another game called Planet Crafter, but gameplay wise they are quite different. I was leaning more towards a gameplay that has the player just build stuff and gain points, which is closer to something like Cookie Clicker, meanwhile Planet Crafter is more focused on the player building a base, exploring the map, and getting resources to survive and build machines, kinda like Subnautica. This game features quite a few cool systems, like the player that can actually move around the planet's surface, or the terraformation system that allows every aspect of the planet to change in real time. For example, an atmosphere can form, clouds can appear, the ice can melt and produce an ocean, and the ground can get covered in moss. The main materials like the clouds and the ground all use a custom shader, which allows them to be changed dynamically by just tweaking a few variables. This allows a lot more control over the parts that would be really static if they were to use a pre-made texture. As usual with my gem games, the thing that caused me to abandon the project was a scope that was way too big to be finished before the gem ends. However, this project isn't fully dead yet. The systems made for it and the style are both pretty good, so when I'm done with my current big project, I might continue it. Speaking of my current main project, there are 2 months here where I mainly worked on a single game that is still my current big project. I say mainly since I wouldn't be me without making some random stuff. Just to list a few examples, a game where you play as a snail, because for some reason I thought that would be fun, a game where you are God and you can make tiny dudes explode, a stacking city builder made in Godot because I wanted to try and learn it, which ended horrendously due to Godot's physics, a game where you use random ability cards to finish levels, a racing game about a meme cat that ended up getting nearly 200,000 views on TikTok, and the city skylines like grid-based water system. And these are just a few of the interesting ones. Anyways, back to my current project for a bit. It's a high score based factory builder where you have to build a factory in a limited area to feed an ever growing number of receivers. Please let me know in the comments if y'all would be interested in a full develop for this game, since it has quite a few cool design choices and a pretty interesting history dating back to a game jam I did way back in 2021. Well, I think that's enough for the rapid firing of smaller stuff and promoting my current game, so let's get back to the video. This project was one of the few times I wasn't working alone. I had a friend helping out with making the textures for stuff, making the 2D art for the UI, and concepting enemies and the friendly NPCs. The idea for this game was pretty complex. It was planned to be a side-view hack-and-slash roguelike that has items that modify parts of your body. The plan for the story was that the player was kidnapped and used in inhumane experiments in a mysterious facility during which their skin was taken away. And sometime later, due to a malfunction, every experiment holding cell opened, flooding the facility with monsters, but also releasing the player. and from then on, the player would have to go from elevator to elevator, descending into the depths of the facility, facing more and more dangerous experiments in order to get their skin back. I had a pretty modular system made for the items since I had a friend working along with me who, while talented at art and music, can't really code, which forced me to make the systems as easy to work with as possible. The way the items work is that every single item is a scriptable object that allows body parts to be turned off and costume parts to replace them. It also allows for different parts of the body to be scaled, and it even lets parts have a max size, which when crossed makes them explode. It also allows every stat to be changed in multiple ways, like adding or multiplying, and it also allows the player's moveset to be changed. For example, the claws change the basic attack to a slash. Some of the other interesting items were the protein eyes that grew one of the player's eyes at random, and if one of them grew too big it would explode, drastically reducing the visible area. The head growth pills that grows the player's head, but if used too much it can lead to the player's head popping like a balloon, leading to an instant game over. The protein powder that grows the player's arms so their attacks reach farther away. The hungry frog, which sits on top of the player's head and has a random chance to eat one of the nearby enemies. And Daddy, who is a clump of cancerous cells that when ingested grows an extra head on the player's neck that sucks away half of their healing received. I also had a status effect system implemented that allowed statuses to be triggered by items. For example, the barbed wire adds a chance to trigger bleeding, which will continuously damage the target. There is also a frost effect, but I didn't have an item made for that. You probably noticed the yellow dude in the background by now. That's Barry, and he was planned to run Barry's Bargains, which is a shop that could pop up at the start or at the end of a level, offering 3 random items that could be bought for money you collected. There were 2 enemies concepted before the game got abandoned. One is the crawler that crawls around the ground and leaves a trail of blood, and can have multiple variants that make the blood as status effects to the player, like poison, and the spider eye, which was meant to jump on the player's head, locking their movement and forcing them to do a button mash quicktime event to get it off. Around this point we realized that this game is way too big to be finished without devoting all of our time to it and burning out in the process, so we ended up dropping it. This project is an interesting one. It was a spin-off to a project that I only released test versions for. You could probably tell just by looking at it, but it was a game heavily inspired by Super Monkey Ball, which for people who don't know the series is a game where you play as a monkey in a ball and you move by tilting the map. This was a pretty big project that I worked on for quite a bit, which means I have lots of early development footage of it, so I think it would be funny if you look back on how it evolved. It started out as a simple monkey ball type game without it being a spin-off to my other project. The idea to make it a spin-off came quite a bit after I got the basic mechanics implemented. As a small tip for the more beginner devs watching, Unity's text and TextMesh Pro components both support rich text, so you can use markup text to color bits of the text, like I did here with the score counter. This was around the point where the idea to turn this project into a spin-off popped up. The question then was who it should be a spin-off about. I ended up going with the Flunt, which is this little cutie right here from that big project I was talking about earlier, but you will hear more about them and that big project a bit later on in the video. After this point I started adding a lot of connections to the other game. For example, all the mobs are grouped into teams that are islands that appear in the other project. I'm actually super proud of this level select screen. It uses the in-game mechanic of tilting the map, which makes it a lot less boring than just clicking through some menus. Once you have your island selected, you can move onto it and select a level by using the same tilting mechanics. The levels also show your highest achieved score on them and the amount of tries, the amount of losses and the amount of wins. There is also practice mode, which never ended up finished, that allows safeguards to be turned on like checkpoints. When you press play, you get transitioned into the level, see a small cutscene that takes you through the whole level, and then you're given controls. The gameplay is all about getting to the finish line before the timer runs out. Most levels are made in a way where they aren't that hard to complete, but they have tons of more challenging branches that have score pickups. Your score is used in the overall progression. Every level score is saved, and then each island adds together your current top score from all of the levels, and based on your progress you get some cool cosmetics, like hats and balls. This project had quite a high skill ceiling, and without glazing myself too much, it was pretty fun to play. If you wanna try it out for yourself, the public beta is still out for free and there should be a link for it down in the description. And while you're down there, maybe consider liking the video since it helps me get pushed by the algorithm. While this game was fun to play, it wasn't very fun for me to work on it. It was very different from my usual open-ended games, which forced me into doing level design that was and still is one of my weakest skills. Due to me just not having fun and the games go spiraling way over the small spin-off I planned it to be, I ended up putting it on ice temporarily and later on abandoning it fully when I stopped working on the big project it was meant to be a spin-off to. This is another gem game, which this time was made for the Revival gem, which is a gem where you either revive one of your dead games or revive a piece of forgotten media from the gaming space. I decided to go with the latter and make a game inspired by a franchise that was mainly forgotten by the public. I'm a huge FromSoft fanboy, so I decided to make something in vein of their Kingsfield series, since apart from a few videos looking back on it, it wasn't discussed much. Recently, it's getting a tad bit more recognition though, especially in terms of games inspired by it. For example, Lucid is a game that came out at the end of last year, which perfectly encapsulates what makes Kingsfield a good series. The jam was 2 weeks long, so I thought I would be able to make something with a bigger scope. Since I'm talking about this game in a video about failed projects, you can probably guess how the bigger scope ended up working out. The idea was having the player be a sort of courier, delivering something that would keep the world alive. The story was planned to be that at the center of the world there is a tower with a beating heart inside it, which keeps the world together. And every 100 years, a random person is awakened from their death and are tasked with going to the tower so they can be sacrificed and their heart can take the place of the previous one. The gameplay was planned with the player being the awakened one, and they would have to make their way through the lands, seeing how everything around them is slowly falling apart and how everyone is suffering. And at the end, once they reach the tower, they could keep the cycle going and sacrifice themselves or break the cycle and stab the heart. Just from hearing this long description, you probably know already why this project ended up failing. It was a way too ambitious idea that I was planning on doing in a way too short of a time frame. Let's talk a bit about gameplay. Since it was meant to be a Kingsfield-like game, the combat was a mix of magic and swords in a first-person perspective. The way it works is that the player has a right and a left hand, and they can have one item or weapon in each, and both hands use a separate attack point, so both can be used independently. I was also planning on adding dodges with a stamina system, but I didn't get that far. Exploration-wise, I planned the map to be a few bigger open areas, connected by interlooping corridors with lots of secret passages and hidden traps. I didn't end up doing any of that though. The only part that ended up finished was the starting graveyard and a small secret route in the well. Around this point, I realized that even with 2 weeks, this idea was impossible to complete without running out of time, so I stopped working on it. This is probably my biggest failure to date. I've worked on this project on and off for over 2 years, restarting it from the ground up many times. Since this was one of my first bigger projects, and my first project I actually planned charging money for, I hosted a ton of public tests to get as much feedback as possible so it would be as good as can be. Due to these public tests, I have a ton of older builds of the game dating back to the end of 2021, so we can go through the entire development timeline and judge my past self for his mistakes. The project started out without a real identity. All I knew that I wanted to make a survival game that was set on floating islands. Just to explain the visuals a bit, before this point most of my projects were either made up of simple shapes or were made entirely out of programmer art, so I barely had any experience with modeling, lighting and color theory. It was around this point where I ended up getting a teeny tiny bit hooked on a game called Factorio. And so, as any dev would do, I immediately got the itch to make something like it, and this project was the perfect candidate. The first thing I got implemented that was related to automation was the belts. I had no clue how I should go about it, so I ended up making the entire thing physics based, which was the stupidest idea ever that somehow ended up turning into the main identity of the game, though we will get to that in a later bit. Next, I wanted to start working on the main gameplay loop of the game. What I had in mind at first was that being a central core on your island, and you constantly had to feed it resources to stop the island from falling apart. Around this point was when I started working on the basics of map generation too, though it was just a set-sized area for now. There's a bit of a time skip here, since I didn't really do any builds. I was mostly just working on polishing up the visuals and adding new buildings like the vertical belts. I was also working on adding more stuff to the core gameplay loop, like being able to craft items. In the next build I did a ton of things, one of them being adding a menu. Comparing this to the menu the game had when I abandoned it, it really highlights just how much I improved over the course of this project. In this build I also temporarily forced the player onto a flat map since I was working on making the map generation of the main game infinite. This is also where the physics-based items started getting used a bit more. I added a building that can launch items dropped on it, which were an addition that made the game stand out from all the other factory builders. After that I kept busy, adding more and more things like furnaces and improved visuals. I was also working on expanding the map by adding more island types like the mushroom lands and adding infinite generation. Around this point I was well over a year into working on this game and it was still nowhere near complete, but I kept working still, not just because I didn't want to give up on working on this game, but also because over the months the game got a small community built around it who I wouldn't want to disappoint. That community ended up being the thing that caused the most issues though. Since I was doing public builds, I felt obligated to release builds as fast as possible, and when it took too long to make a build, I felt the need to make the next build have much more features, which ended up in me working on a ton of stuff that had nothing to do with the main gameplay loop, like a separate challenge mode and a challenge editor. At this point the idea morphed into something way bigger than my original concept. The new concept the game was being built around was that all the planets close to us have been drained of resources by a mega corporation, and humanity is struggling to expand. And said mega corporation launched an initiative where they send robots into alternate dimensions to harvest resources from that dimension and send them back. And this is where the player comes in. They're one of these robots, but when they're being sent through, their memory chip glitches and they lose all their blueprints and they have to research everything all over again, starting with building assembly lines with wooden rollers as beds to having robots transport everything from A to B. I was already starting to feel like this idea was not possible, but I kept pushing through, adding stuff like lakes generating on islands and water physics for buoyant items. I forgot to mention this before, but this project is where the Lea guy for that spin-off game came from. They were the only creature to get implemented into the game, though I planned a lot more. They are quite dumb. The Lea basically just rolls randomly, checking if there is a stable floor in front of them, and if there isn't, they just turn around and use all their energy doing a big push. I was also messing around with trying to put combat into the game as if it wasn't bloated enough already. Funnily a fact, I actually did devlogs for this game back when I was working on it. The devlogs are of questionable quality.
Hey guys.
I don't wanna die from embarrassment, so that 2-second clip is all you're gonna get. This project's failure came from an insane amount of scope creep, which was mainly the result of me trying to add as much features as possible into the public test build. Anyways, I think I went over all the interesting bits of this project, so it's about time we move on. This is the oldest abandoned project I still have a build for. The build doesn't really contain much, it's just a single level, but I still wanted to include it just so I could talk about tutorial hell. Tutorial hell is something every beginner dev falls into. It's when you rely on a tutorial for every single thing you do, never actually learning what your code does, and then dropping a project as soon as you need to do something that there isn't a step-by-step guide for. Around when I was working on this project when I fell into tutorial hell myself. Before this, all my projects were slowly building up in complexity as I learned coding. But then I made an FPS controller based on a tutorial, and it immediately got to my head that with just watching a tutorial and copying the code, I achieved more than any of my previous projects combined. Once you fall into tutorial hell, it's incredibly hard to get out. What helped was relearning everything from the ground up, only using my engine's documentation when I didn't know how to do something. Anyways, I'm sure you're already sick of watching the same clip loop over and over again, so let's move on. Before ending the video, I wanted to do another speedfire round of smaller stuff that I feel like are cool enough to be shown, but don't have enough content for a full segment. Plus, if I did a full segment for everything, we would be stuck here for multiple hours. These projects aren't really ordered. Some have been abandoned recently, some multiple months ago. This was planned to be a platformer with active ragdolls, kinda like Happy Wheels. It uses a 2D ragdoll and maps the 3D model onto it, which is pretty cool in my opinion. The idea for this one was a stealth hacker game where the entire game runs on an in-universe coding language, and to hack stuff you rewrite the code of the actual objects in the game. I made this random buckshot roulette originally released. I liked the game so much that I wanted to make a small fan game to it. The main gameplay is that you have guillotines rigged up to your fingers, and each one of your fingers is one of your lives. You and your opponent cut wires that might damage you, might damage them, or might do nothing. This project also had some music made for it by the friend who did the art for one of the games previously mentioned. This is one of those abandoned projects that I still wanna continue one day, because even in a half-done state, it's pretty fun to play. This was planned to be a speedrun platformer where you use portals to fling yourself around the map. While it was fun to play, it was insanely buggy and a complete headache to work on. This one was planned to be a wizard fighting game where to use spells you need to combine elements in your book in a specific order. This one was yet another time when I tried learning Godot. This time around I was trying out this 3D engine by making a small factory builder. This project was basically just one big UI exercise. I wanted to do a turn-based game that's hacking themed, so the entire battle UI was a command line. Well, I think I managed to go over all the interesting ones, so it's about time we wrap this video up. Thank you so much for watching till this point. I know the editing and the voiceovers were a bit all over the place. Writing scripts, recording voiceovers and editing bits is still pretty new to me. Pinky promise I'll do better for the next one though.